to Politics in the Power. Today's topic is titled Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. What will it cost us and can we stop it? TPP agenda, as we all know, is primarily driven by big business, big corporations and so on. And it offers very little for everyday Australians. So then, is it quite reasonable for us to ask, can we stop the whole thing somehow? The second speaker is Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans. Arthur is a medical practitioner, a politician and a peace activist. He served as a member of the Legislative Council of New South Wales from 1998 till 2007. In 1994, he served as NSW President of the Doctors Reform Society of Australia, through which he argued for the continuation of Medicare and improvements to the public health system. He has also been a leading Australian advocate for the establishment of a Ministry of Peace, or at least a Department of Peace in the Australian government.
I was driving to work yesterday, and on Radio National they were saying the economy is in a terrible state, and there was a good government representative there saying, well, anything that'll help the economy has to be good. Now, when you're in a negotiating position that I'm so desperate I'll take anything, this is not the basis for any sort of sensible policy, and yet that was offered as an opening remark explaining to Radio National listeners why we should have the TPP. And I thought, you know, this sort of being led by this sort of henny penny philosophy is extremely dangerous and stupid. I'll speak about myself briefly just to introduce where I'm coming from. I'm a doctor, and I suppose doctors do lots of little detailed things and have specific knowledge. And so my voyage has been from the particular to the general. Does this thing that I observe, is it more generally applicable? And I used to work a lot in tobacco-caused disease. I call it tobacco-caused disease, not tobacco-related disease. It's tobacco-caused, let's be clear about this. And I suppose I've always thought about things a little laterally, not what you're supposed to see, what do you actually see, and what would you like to see are the two questions. So that rather than saying, have we done a wonderful job treating this cancer, we have to say, we haven't actually cured this cancer very often, and there's a lot of other disease about, and why is this disease here, and does it have to be here, and wouldn't prevention be a lot smarter than cure? So in a sense, I went from looking at the small picture of health to the bigger picture. And then having gone from the small picture of health to the bigger picture of health, I thought, well, let's go from the smaller picture of social policy, how long does this bloke need in jail, to what made him commit the crime or even start on the first crime that escalated to the bigger crimes. In other words, look at preventive social policy as well as curative health policy. And most people, when they talk about health, they don't actually mean health. The whole word's been stolen. When they talk about health policy, they mean the paying for illness treatment policy is what they actually mean. They don't mean health policy. When the United Nations or World Health Organization got together and defined health as a state of physical and mental well-being, everyone said, oh yes, gosh, that is what it is. Fancy that, of course. Because it had kind of been forgotten over the last n squared years. And of course, if you then try to put money into that concept, you have difficulty again, because money that is visible and now is much more important than visible than money that is coming in the future. While you may have the religion that the market will fix everything, the religion that if you look after kids you'll get less people in jail is a harder religion to sell. And yet I think a far more valid one. So as I started to work against tobacco, there was absolutely no money in that. So I went into public service and learned about how public services work. And as part of that, I was interested in how good medical treatment was, so I got involved in absence management and quality control in medicine, so I did some time in that. I then went into politics, as was said, and spent some time with the Democrats in the upper house, but didn't get much credit for that, and so I got kicked out of that a lot. And then I studied political economy for a while, and now I'm back in clinical medicine again, which is kind of much less cost effective than what I was doing before. Although, again, far more lucrative, of course. But it's reminded me as I go into workers' comp, where I see people who are dependent on insurance companies, of the unbelievable callousness that you see in some corporate behaviour. They don't care if someone's life is totally wrecked. They don't care if they actually met the criteria for deserving to be paid. They are maximising their profit, thank you very much, and they have a straight choice between paying somebody injured and giving more money to shareholders, and frankly, it's a non-contest. And it reminds me of when I was studying workplace absence, and I call it workplace absence rather than absenteeism. I went to America and looked at the American health system, which of course I was also interested in through the Doctors Reform Society, and they have a very, very two-tiered system there, where if you haven't got any money, I mean, the first thing that gets examined by the ambulance man is your wallet. And if that's not up to scratch, well, sorry mate. And I could tell some funny stories. Maybe I should just digress a fraction and tell a funny story. I've been given a bunch of contacts because I was studying workplace absence actually, and I'd stopped in an insurance company in New York to look at quality control of medical practitioners by insurance companies that were making sure that the doctors weren't wasting any money. And the lady there was very delighted to have a handsome young Australian chap there to talk to and have a cup of coffee with rather than the mundane stuff she was doing. So we were sitting there in her office having a nice cup of coffee, and the phone rang, you see, and she says, no, Jan, I got Dr. Evans here, I can't talk now. Phone rings again, no, I don't want to talk to you now. Phone rings the third time. Oh, all right, put him through. Excuse me, Dr. Evans, you don't mind if I just take this call? No, that's fine. Sitting there and thinking about my coffee. Now, look here. What? You're the doctor, are you? You're the doctor? Yes? You want to ring person? Yes? What's the problem? Yeah? She's got an infected breast, huh? And she's what? She's 3 days postpartum. 3 days, is she? Look, she's got 3 days. Her insurance policy says that when she has a baby, she can have 3 days in hospital, and after that she has to get out. And that's what she gets, what she's paid for, and that's what she gets, okay? No, we're not going to pay 1 cent more. Well, then, I don't know, maybe they'll have a district nurse or something and tell her how to fix her breasts. I don't know. That's not my problem. The problem is we get paid for 3 days, and that's what you get. Dr. Evans, how's the coffee there? Now, this is exactly how it is. That's how it was in the US in 1985, and that's how it is in Australia today.
Yeah.
Although in Australia today, they would have said, wait 3 weeks for us to make a decision. Although that's only when, it's not when the patient's in hospital, that's when they're waiting for the surgery. Are they in agony? Well, shucks, it takes us 3 weeks to be sure about what we're doing, you know. And I see that every day. So when the American health system, which is much criticised, is very good at what it does, which is turning human suffering into money, turning it into a commodity. It is a thing you buy and sell, supposedly in a competitive model. And of course, that, in my view, is absurd. But the more you commodify and privatise, the more you have this conflict of interest. And the more you have things that are competitive, it means, look, I'm not making enough profit here. And then, of course, if you can be sued for not making enough profit, or the government can be sued for not making enough profit, like having a Medicare or something like that that treats everyone equally, you have a problem. And I don't believe that the private sector is any more efficient. And I think there's a certain ethos from a doctor's point of view. I mean, I'm speaking as a doctor who's been... It is very nice to just say, look, I'm going to treat my patients today. I'm going to have relationships with them, I'm going to do what they need, I'm going to feel good, I'm going to advocate for them. And I don't have to think about money. I don't have to say, how much money have you got, how much money do I need from you? I don't have to think about that. It's really quite nice to be salaried and say, look, I get the money from here and I treat the patient there. I don't have to have any conflicts of interest. And the interesting thing is, my patients now are in workers' comp, and they have to wait for the approval of the insurance company to have the x-ray they need, and then the operation they need, and they wait for however many weeks it takes the insurance companies to decide that they may or may not pay. And then, of course, sometimes insurance companies decide that this isn't a valid thing. They had a car accident and somebody wrote that they bumped their head, but later they got a pain in the arm because their neck's sore. Oh, we didn't approve the neck. We only approved the head. So we have this endless argument with lawyers, and it might drag on for months. And then, of course, some consultants won't see them unless they're paid in advance because they're sick of the hassle from the insurance companies. So then you spend your time, which which doctor will actually treat them. And my partner, Con Costa, who was to give the talk tonight but isn't back from overseas, says, oh yes, well, you know, that was his opinion for private patients. I wonder what he would have said if he, you know, like, in a sense, he's accustomed to the idea that people have two different opinions depending on their payment system. Now, that's never used to be like that. At least my father was a surgeon. He never thought like that. But I do believe this comes into your thinking, particularly if you're not going to get paid by the insurance company. And of course, Medicare is about half what the insurance companies pay as well. So of course, there is a considerable economic thing, and the government is driving Medicare rebates down. So we have, at the moment, a universal system which treats you by how sick you are, not by how rich you are, but it's gradually being undermined so that the doctors won't be able to afford to do that. It'll only become for people with concession cards, because you might as well get paid something by the concession cards as opposed to being a bad debt, which of course used to be what happened before Medicare. You had a fair few bad debts in your practice. So all of this, as it becomes contestable by companies, and then as it becomes contestable in the sense that they actually attack the government, this is the way things are moving. And I just want to put that situation. Unfortunately, it does affect medical practice. If you look at the caesarean rates in private patients, it's always been much higher. Some people would say, well, you know, the private rates right, the public patients should be having more caesareans, but the rates are pretty obscene. And the rates are also so for tonsillectomy. So the other thing, as I said, was I was an anti-tobacco campaigner for many years. I make no bones about that. I mean, I think the tobacco companies have absolutely no morals, and it took me a long time to get my head around the concept that people were quite happy to kill people for money. But I really have got my head around that. People are quite happy. I know this is going to kill you, but I really don't care. I want the money. If it kills you, tough luck, silly you. And that is a philosophy, and it's kind of naked capitalism, if you want to put it that way, in an almost caricature sense, but that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. And if we look at what the tobacco companies are actually doing, of course they're very upset that we finally, and it only took 50 years, more than 50 years, to get governments committed to actually lowering tobacco-caused disease. And finally, that wonderful health minister who actually introduced plain paper packaging and the generic packaging, in which the marketing of the excitement of the packet, the red one or the gold one, depending on what you were, or the friendly Peter Jackson, or the exclusive Benson Hedges, or the rugged Marlboro person, which people could identify with, this absurd image that was taken, which we in Bugger Up took the piss out of. They actually said, no, it's actually a smelly, dirty thing. We'll put a picture of what actually happens on the front and we'll give it a brand name. And of course, that's taking their intellectual property, because of course their marketing is totally dependent very much on the pack, which is the final link between the fantasy and the cancer, as it were. They're actually suing through Ukraine and through Hong Kong. They're suing the Australian government. The bill, as Pat said, is up to $50 million now, and they're going to increase it. They're going to do that. And of course, New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, Nepal, and most of the Pacific states are not introducing plain paper packaging because they're seeing how Australia goes in the World Trade Organisation. Australia's already actually taken, Philip Morris has already taken the Australian government to the Australian High Court, where the Australian government won against Philip Morris. But of course, they're now taking us to the World Trade Organisation, which is just a bunch of corporate lawyers race, basically, with no appeal mechanism, who will decide whatever a bunch of corporate lawyers think. And how much does a corporate lawyer know about public health, or care for that matter? I mean, a dollar's a dollar as far as they're concerned, in my experience. So Uruguay, in fact, put in plain paper packaging and was sued and had to get the Bloomberg Philanthropic Trust and the Gates Foundation to pay for the legal costs, because they were going to be unable to fund the defence of their public health system. So that shows, in a sense, I mean, as you may know, of the biggest entities in the world, in the top 100, there are more corporations than countries. So we've now reached a situation where the world's almost ungovernable because the corporations are bigger than the countries. And of course, they tend to pay no tax because they structure it so that they do loans across borders, so that in the high-tax countries they make no profit, in the low-tax countries they make all their profit and pay no tax. So in a sense, they have an advantage over any business that actually has to stay in one place and pay tax, which is why they are so flexible. Anyway, that's all a bit political, I suppose. If you look at what's happening, let's take a drug like AZT, which of course is the first of the antiretroviral drugs that was used against AIDS. AZT was actually invented in 1964 by a publicly funded research in an attempt to find an anti-leukemic drug. It didn't work against leukemia, so they thought, damn it all, we wasted all this money and stuck it on the shelf. It sat on the shelf for 22 years, unpatented. When the AIDS epidemic came in 1981, they discovered the virus in 1983, and in 1986 they discovered that AZT had some properties against the virus. So Glaxo immediately patented it. They'd done no research except to find that it actually worked. It became the most lucrative drug in the world, and they were charging $10,000 US per patient per year to have it. And it wasn't until, I think, 1989 that there was protests in America about the cost of the drugs, and so they arbitrarily lowered the price to $6,400 more or less overnight because of the protests. Meanwhile, in Africa, of course, they were having huge problems with HIV and AIDS, and of course they couldn't afford that sort of price for the drugs. And an Indian pharmaceutical company said that, look, we can produce drugs for 7 cents per day, which was down from about $1 a day, which they were asking from the drug companies. So you're talking about 7% of the cost. And they wouldn't allow. And the Americans threatened trade sanctions against South Africa if they dared to use any generic drugs to actually lower the cost of HIV. And it was, of course, it was shown that the mother-to-child transmission is reduced by 50% for someone on AZT, and of course it much lowers the count of virus in the blood, so that in fact if someone's taking AZT and they're not doing the right thing in terms of condoms and proper procedures, they still have a much lower transmission rate than if they're not taking the AZT, quite apart from the person infected living longer. But this was actually stopped by the American trade sanctions because they felt the whole intellectual property and rights would crumble if this particular thing was happening. So in the meantime, you're talking 20 million people with AIDS. You're not talking small numbers here. You're talking a country full, really. And that's how cynical it was, and that's how brutal the pharmaceutical companies were faced with a real public health emergency. So when I talk about corporates and cynicism and hardness, you know, we're not dreaming here. And eventually, in fact, Vice President Gore's election campaign was attacked in 1999, and he was criticised as being an exponent of this under Clinton. In fact, he didn't back off until it looked like affecting his election campaign. Now, the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefits System, was an Australian designed by a guy called David Henry, who's a professor in Newcastle. And the idea of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme is it's basically a buying cartel. So effectively the PBS says we will buy the medicines. If we can buy them cheaply, we will buy large quantities, and we will sell them to the Australian people more cheaply. And because we get them more cheaply, that will be passed on. So Australia had the cheapest medicines in the world and set this model up. Not only did they have a buying cartel in terms of pushing the price down, they also had a research arm, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Assessment Committee, which not only assessed the drug, but assessed it not only in its clinical effectiveness, but in its cost effectiveness. So if a new blood pressure drug comes out and they say, look, this is wonderful, look, there's no side effects, it's absolutely fantastic. So hang on, we have lots of blood pressure drugs. How much better is it? How much less side effects has it got? And how much are we willing to pay for that? How much is the benefit in terms of less side effects, and how much is that benefit worth? And let's be hard-nosed about this. We might pay you an extra 20% over the ones that we've got on the list, but we're not going to pay you what you ask, which is 3 times what the existing ones are. And then, of course, if they say we won't give it to you then the PB, Pharmaceutical Benefits Assessment Committee, says, well, you know, come back with a more reasonable offer. We can manage with the blood pressure drugs we've got. In other words, you have to be willing to say no and to assess them systematically. Now, unfortunately, John Howard changed the scheme, and from the Pharmaceutical Benefits Assessment Committee, there's then a Pharmaceutical Pricing Assessment Committee, onto which he put 2 drug reps out of 6, which of course meant that having decided whether they wanted it or not, the pricing of it was then a matter for negotiation. Now, David Henry, in fact, resigned at this. He was, in fact, they put enough people on the committee that his vote would be, he said, well, look, I'm not going to back off from what we've been doing. We've got the most cost-effective system in the world. And in fact, people used to come to Australia to learn how to do it. And they've now gone away and they're doing it much better than we are. And there was a huge period when Australian drugs became immensely more expensive than foreign drugs, basically because of this interference with the PBS. And of course, now the thing goes from the Pharmaceutical Benefits Assessment Committee to the Pharmaceutical Pricing Assessment Committee, which is the one with 2 drug reps on it. Then it goes to Cabinet, of all places. So it's become a politicised process. The beauty of the old scheme was it was not politicised. A few doctors who weren't known to the public said, look, this is cost effective to do, this is the price, this is what we do. Now it's politicised, and every time you'll see a new group that says there's now drugs available for this or that rare condition, it's announced by the minister. In other words, it's a gift from the government to you. So we've taken away scientific rigour and we now have it all politicised in order to get kudos for the government and less value for the taxpayer. And in Australia, when patents expire, the price has to drop 16%. That'll teach them. In most countries, it drops 50% when they come off patent. So patents are used to keep the price up as intellectual property, and they're wanting to change it from, I think, from 20 years to 25 years as part of this TPP. And as I say, the price is whatever number you can think of. There was a time when Australian generics were 10 times the price of foreign generics. 10 times the price. And there's a drug, Con rang me from Greece the other day. He said it's $65 for Symbicort, which is a long-acting anti-asthma drug in routine use in Australia, which in Australia costs, I think, $5, and it's $65 in Europe. So the drug price is whatever number you first thought of, really. And it's really about tough negotiation. And if this negotiation is nobbled by an international trade treaty and enforced by a corporate lawyer from the World Trade Organization, we're in big trouble. I wanted to give a list of prices today, but it's actually quite difficult to find the prices in Australia because one of the deals the drug company make with the PBS is the prices are not public because, of course, if everybody finds out that Australia gets their drugs for X, then, of course, Germany and Italy and France and America will want their drugs at that price also. So, in fact, part of the deal is that the price is a secret. So it's actually quite difficult to compare. Australian drugs have become a lot cheaper lately, but that's only because the dollar's gone from $1.03 US to 70 cents, which of course has given us a 30-something cent, 30% drop. But that's no thanks to the negotiations of the PBS. But the PBS is a buying cartel. Let's not gild the lily here. Let's be honest about what it is. But we have, on the other hand, selling cartels. The drug company have a drug and say, well, we've got the intellectual property. You can either pay our price or die. That's what it boils down to when they're in patent. Let's not kid ourselves about that. If that's the only drug for that purpose, it's pay or die. And that was the position that the Africans were in and can be in. The Australian generic market is again tends to be seen as much cheaper, and it is to some extent. However, 50% of it was owned by one company, Alpha Pharma, which is also a multinational, 20% by Sigma, which is a big company, and a lot of the generics in Australia are actually manufactured by the company that manufactured the drug originally. So they actually produced 2 drugs the same, simply in different packets with different names. Of course, they can do it cheaply because they're already producing them. They just have to run the machine a bit longer. And there's no real incentive to lower the price. So there is a problem. I discovered about drugs and marketing in Australia. I kind of found that out as I was giving this talk, and I probably shouldn't go on that because it's not related to this subject, although it's one of those lurks. And it does illustrate, again, which I think I've illustrated adequately already, that the idea that when there's a clash between profits and public good, at the moment profits are winning. And anything that's, the TPP in my assessment is part of there's been a general trend since the Second World War for corporations to get stronger and multinational as trade becomes easier across borders, it becomes cheaper, the technology, the transport becomes cheaper, the transfer of money becomes cheaper, the transfer of goods and labour becomes cheaper. We have the growth of the power of multinationals as against the nation state, which are limited in geography. And this, eventually when someone's weak enough, you can not only beat them, you can actually dictate what they're going to do. Since I'm about to bash you up, I'll just take your wallet and your watch first, but at the moment I'll leave your jumper on. You know, and it's as if the governments are yielding to this pressure of corporations saying you can have this, but you can't have that. And I think at the moment the pressure of public opinion has got a tenuous grip on things, but governments are not willing to do it. And certainly, my experience in Parliament was that ministers seriously believed they couldn't stand up to industry. You know, I was a little crossbencher, and I knew that if I could get enough numbers to say no in the Parliament, you know, we said no, and that was that. But the minders of ministers who came up with absurd propositions would say, look, we have to do this, mate. That's fine. Well, the industry wants it, mate. Well, say, hang on, who's running the show? Excuse me? In a sense, sometimes you have as much power as you take. And that's what governments, I think, have to recognise. You have as much power as you take. If you want as much power as you're given, you won't have very much. And I think this whole PBS concept is a sellout, and to see it as an inevitable is quite wrong. Some years ago I was invited to the, what was it called? Public Relations Association of Australia dinner. Now I wouldn't normally have been invited to a thing like that because I'm not really the sort of chap they wanted. But they wanted to use the parliamentary dining room. They needed an MP to invite them. And the speaker was Abe Ridgway, and he was a Democrat, so I was the, what do you call the host? The Trojan horse? No, the host that led them in. So there I am sitting up at the top table with me. And there opposite me was the chap from McDonald's. I was feeling a bit devilish, so I said, tell me, do you take any responsibility for the rise in childhood obesity in Australia? And it was just the case of the what do you call it, the McLible trial. Was going on, and had been going on for some time. And of course the chap from McDonald's, no, we tried to bring in healthy products, but they won't sell, you know, ridiculous, you know, none of our fault, you know, free choice. And I said, whenever I go there, they say, would you like fries with that? Just when I'm looking at my order and figuring out what to do. When I'm my most suggestible, they say, no, I don't want any fries. Then you want them. That's made my order not to get fat, and I don't want to. Oh, well, that's just marketing. Anyway, I left the point. And the guy next to him was really offended, and he said, you know, he was really offended by my conversation with the McDonald's man. He said, what right do you have to tell me what to do with my business? And I said, I'm glad you asked me that. It's like this. 4% of New South Wales elected me, but I'm acting for 100% of them. And if it's good for the people of New South Wales, I'm going to do it. And if it's bad for the people of New South Wales, I'm going to stop it. And that's what I'm here for, and that's what I've got my legitimacy for. And what legitimacy have you got for the people of New South Wales?
Yeah.
And I might have hit him with a wet fish. He sat there going, because that's not what politicians are supposed to say to people. But that is the situation. These people are elected to look after us. That's what they've got to do. And they look after us against people who might harm us. And that's true in medicine and corporations and any other field you want to look. And I think people forget that. And we as citizens have the right to demand that, and we should. You know, it's all power to Pat and the AFTNet team, I reckon, because we really have to stand up and be counted, because if the government simply says, well, we have to, yeah, here's my, and please don't bash me, here's my watch and my wallet, you know, that's not how we're going to get on. We don't have to go to the lowest denominator. We have the right to have our government looking after us. And certainly that's the case in medicine, and I think it's the case in the whole of society we live in. Thanks very much.